On my birthday, my son slid the head chair away and said, "That spot's not for you anymore, Dad." The roast steamed, the clock ticked, and my place card waited at the far end like a punishment. I rose without a word, stepped out into the cool night, and before midnight I'd return with something that would make every fork in that room freeze midair. If stories like this remind you how wisdom and quiet resolve can set things right, stay with me. Subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know who's gathered at the table tonight. I've always believed a man earns his place at the head of the table, not by demanding it, but by showing up, day after day, for the people he loves. For 50 years, that's exactly what I did. I built homes with my own hands, fixed what was broken, and never left a debt unpaid. My back carries the proof, an old ache that wakes me before dawn, reminding me of years spent on ladders and scaffolds, swinging hammers through blistering summers and bone-chilling winters. Most mornings follow the same gentle rhythm. I rise early, brew strong coffee, and sit by the window of the small apartment I've rented since Margaret passed. From there, I can just see the roofline of the house I once owned outright, the same house I signed over to my son, Paul, when his family started to grow. "A gift," I'd said, sliding the deed across the kitchen counter, "so you and Emily can give the kids a good life." Paul promised I'd always have a place there. For a while, he kept that promise. Life these days is quiet. I tend to a small balcony garden, read the paper with a pencil ready for the crossword, and polish the old pocket watch my father left me. Friends stop by sometimes for cards, and neighbors wave when I water the plants. To anyone passing by, I look like an ordinary 74-year-old man, content with a modest life. But there's a memory that still burns bright. I was 21, coming home from a long day laying bricks. My hands were raw from the sun. My father sat at our kitchen table, gray from fieldwork. He pushed a plate toward me before serving himself. "Always feed others before you take a bite," he said. That lesson stuck. I spent my life serving first, my parents, my wife, my children, and somewhere along the way, I forgot to save a chair for myself. Sundays used to be my favorite. I'd carve the roast, pour Margaret a glass of wine, and tell stories while Paul passed the gravy. But over time, things shifted. Emily began seating me farther down the table, closer to the kids, as if I were a guest rather than the man who'd built those walls. Paul said nothing, just offered a tight smile whenever my eyebrows rose. I told myself families change, that chairs get moved and roles evolve. Yet every holiday left a heavier knot in my chest. One evening I caught my reflection in the dining room window, shoulders bent, balancing a plate on my lap because there weren't enough chairs, and I barely recognized the man staring back. Still, I kept showing up. I brought wine, fixed wobbly shelves, and quietly paid for a new fence. Margaret used to say, "Patience is a quiet strength," and I tried to honor that. I convinced myself they still valued me, even if they didn't say it out loud. Then, last week, Paul phoned with an invitation for Sunday dinner. "Big news," he said, cheerful as ever. I offered to bring a pie, but he laughed and told me not to fuss. I hung up feeling hopeful, polishing my shoes that night as though preparing for something special. I didn't know that the calm I'd built, brick by brick, habit by habit, was about to be tested. But that calm was about to break. When I arrived that Sunday, the house looked as though it had been staged for a magazine spread. A wreath hung on the door, and the smell of rosemary and garlic drifted through the open kitchen window. I knocked, but Emily called out, bright and cheery, "Come on in, Dad." I stepped into the dining room and stopped cold. The long oak table gleamed, candles flickering against polished silver. Plates and folded napkins waited, every place set with care, except one. At the head of the table, where I'd always sat, a card read reserved. My name wasn't on it. Instead, a folding chair sat at the far end, wedged against the wall like an afterthought. Paul looked up from carving the roast. "Hey, Dad," he said, cheerful but distracted. "Find your seat. We've got an announcement." I rested my hand on the back of that old chair, the one where I'd said grace for decades. "Why am I not sitting here?" I asked quietly. Emily smoothed her apron, her smile too practiced. "We thought it might be nice for Paul to lead dinner tonight," she said. "You've had your turn." A pulse thudded in my ears. My turn, I repeated. Paul cleared his throat. Dad, we're just trying to make new traditions. The kids should see me at the head of the table. I sat in the chair they'd chosen for me. The metal legs wobbled as I lowered myself. Emily passed me a dish without meeting my eyes. Paul raised his voice slightly, trying for cheer. So, he said, we've decided to refinance the house. We'll use some equity for upgrades, and maybe a trip next summer. The words stung, but I stayed silent, tasting iron behind my teeth. Halfway through dinner, Paul lifted his glass. To new beginnings, he said. Everyone clinked except me. That's when Emily leaned closer, speaking just loud enough. You've done your part, Dad. Let us take it from here. But that wasn't the worst. When dessert came, Paul pulled an envelope from his pocket and slid it toward me like a dealer laying down a card. One more thing, he said. We need to tidy up the paperwork. Since you don't really live here anymore, we'd like to put the deeds solely in our names. It'll save confusion if something happens. My fork stopped midair. You're asking me to sign away the last piece of this house? My voice was low even. It's just a formality, Paul replied, avoiding my gaze. You'll always be welcome. I set the fork down carefully, as if it might shatter. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Even the kids had fallen silent, spoons hovering above bowls of cobbler. I pushed the envelope back toward him. No, I said. Paul's eyebrows shot up. Emily shifted. Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be. I rose slowly, folding my napkin with deliberate calm. I built this house, I said. I hammered every nail, paid every bill, and you think I'll sign it away, after you've already shoved me to the corner? No one spoke. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. That's when I decided I wouldn't stay quiet. That night I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the slow sweep of the ceiling fan. Every word from dinner replayed in my head, Emily's syrupy whisper, Paul's steady insistence that I let them handle things. Even the squeak of that folding chair echoed, a reminder of where they believed I belonged. I tried to convince myself I'd misunderstood, that maybe they hadn't meant harm. But each time I closed my eyes, I saw that envelope sliding toward me, their faces expectant. Sleep never came. I brewed tea, stood by the window, and stared at the dark outline of the house I'd built. For days, everything I touched felt heavy with hurt. At the hardware store, my fingers traced hammer handles, remembering how many I'd worn out raising those walls. Even watering the rosemary on my balcony felt hollow. I couldn't shake the scent from Sunday's roast, how it had covered the taste of disappointment. I let their calls go unanswered. A few texts arrived. Hope you're feeling better, Dad. Polite words, nothing more. At cards, George studied me over his glasses. You look like a man who's been robbed, he said. He wasn't wrong. One evening, I pulled a shoebox from the back of my closet. Inside lay a lifetime. Paul perched on my shoulders, Margaret laughing beside us, snapshots of the house mid-construction, me beaming in a sweat-stained cap, faded receipts for lumber, nails, gallons of paint. Each line spoke of sacrifices, weekends traded for security, for a future I thought they'd honor. Margaret's voice came back to me, clear as if she were there. Don't let anyone mistake your kindness for weakness, Tom. She'd said it once long ago, when a neighbor forgot to return a borrowed ladder. I'd laughed then. Now the words felt carved into stone. Loneliness crept in with the dusk, heavier than it had since she'd passed. For the first time, I felt not only her absence but the loss of someone who would have stood between me and this quiet betrayal. Still, under the sting, something steady began to grow. I kept seeing their faces when I refused to sign, a flash of doubt in their certainty. Maybe they'd forgotten who taught them how to build, how to stand tall. On the third evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow notepad. I wrote dates, costs, and memories. I listed names of neighbors who'd seen me on the roof in the rain, of the pastor who'd blessed the frame one Thanksgiving. At the top, in bold letters, I wrote the phrase that had taken root. I wasn't allowed to sit at the head of the table. I left and came back with the keys to the house. The words steadied me. Respect isn't begged for, it's reclaimed. I began to think, very carefully. I didn't rush. That's one advantage of age. You learn the value of steady hands and patient thinking. Instead of storming back to Paul's doorstep, I let the anger settle until it became something sharper, more deliberate. The first thing I did was pull every old document from my fireproof box. Deed copies, tax receipts, the loan release letter from the bank the day I paid off the mortgage. Every line bore my signature, proof of decades spent earning those walls. Then I made a quiet trip across town to see Harold, an old friend and the attorney who'd helped me close on the house years ago. His office smelled of leather and strong coffee. While I spoke, Harold's brows drew together. When I finished, he tapped a folder and said, "Tom, you still hold legal leverage. You transferred occupancy, not full ownership. They can't touch the deed without your consent." That night, I sat at my table reading Harold's notes. The paper felt like armor. The house wasn't just a memory, it was still partly mine. Somewhere between mortgages and family dinners, Paul and Emily had forgotten who hammered the first nail. I began making calls. A locksmith I trusted, a contractor to check the gates and locks, an insurance agent to make sure everything was current. Quietly, I arranged for new keys to be cut, keys for fresh locks that only I would hold. Little did they know, while they were dreaming about a vacation funded by my sweat, I was staging a lesson in respect. When Paul phoned later that week, asking if I felt better, I kept my tone calm. "Getting there?" I said, while a manila folder sat open in front of me, its contents notarized and ready. Each evening I added notes, witnesses who'd watched me build, neighbors who'd seen me shovel snow from that roof, the pastor who'd blessed the home one Thanksgiving. One night I wrote the title phrase across a clean sheet in bold ink. I wasn't allowed to sit at the head of the table. I left and came back with the keys to the house. Seeing it there wasn't just a reminder, it was a vow. There were moments of doubt, like when a grandchild's crayon drawing slipped from the folder, a stick figure me with the caption "Grandpa's chair." I felt a sting behind my eyes. This wasn't only about property. It was about teaching the next generation how respect is kept alive. By Friday, everything was set. The locksmith scheduled, documents signed, my letter to Paul folded neatly in an envelope. Even the timing was chosen, a morning when they'd both be out with the kids. I stood by my window that night, looking toward the house silhouetted in moonlight. The walls seemed to breathe, waiting for me to reclaim the promise I'd built into them. Everything was ready. All I needed was the right moment. The morning I chose was crisp and clear, a day that seemed made for settling things quietly. I parked across the street from the house and let the sun warm the dashboard while I steadied my breath. Beside me lay the folder, the deed, the lawyer's notes, the receipts from a life spent building. A locksmith van rolled up right on time. "Mr. Bennett?" the man asked as he stepped out. I nodded. Within minutes, his tools clicked against brass, replacing every lock on doors I'd hung myself decades before. When he handed me the new keys, they felt heavy, almost alive with meaning. I slipped one into my pocket and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish, and the rosemary Emily loved to scatter on roasts. In the hallway, family photos lined the walls. Paul at Little League, Margaret beaming beside him, Christmas mornings when I'd sat at the head of the table. My chest tightened, but I kept walking. By noon, everything was in place. On the dining table, the same one where Paul had once slid that envelope, I set the folder and a handwritten note. "Paul, respect isn't a seat you're given. It's one you keep by honoring the people who built it. This house carries my name, my work, and a promise to your mother. Until you learn that, the keys stay with me." Then I waited. Late that afternoon, Paul's car pulled up. Through the window, I saw him and Emily laughing, until they noticed the locksmith van leaving. Their faces stiffened. Paul tried the door, frowning when it didn't budge. Inside, I sat calmly at the head of the table, the very seat they'd barred me from. The keys gleamed in front of me. Paul knocked, then called through the door, "Dad, what's going on with the locks?" I opened it slowly. "Come in," I said. They stepped inside, eyes darting to the table. Paul picked up the letter, reading silently. When he looked up, there was guilt and a trace of fear. "You changed the locks?" "I protected what I built," I said, voice steady. The lawyer confirmed the deed was never out of my hands. "You tried to corner me at dinner. Now you'll come to this table on different terms. Emily opened her mouth, but no words came. Paul shifted from foot to foot. Dad, we didn't think you'd go this far. We just wanted to make things simpler. Simple is respect, I replied. Simple is saving me a chair instead of shoving me to the wall. The room went still, the clock ticking softly. Then Paul's shoulders dropped. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I placed one of the new keys on the table in front of him. You're still welcome here, I said. But this home won't run on entitlement. Not while I'm alive. Emily nodded, eyes glistening. The children peeked from the hallway, unsure but curious about the quiet unfolding. I reached out to tousle the youngest one's hair. Go on, I said gently. Help set the table. Tonight, I'll carve the roast. As they settled in, the room felt lighter, steadier. No one touched the head chair until I eased into it. And in that silence, I finally felt free. When I think back on that evening, it isn't the locks or paperwork I remember first. It's the hush that settled over the room when I lowered myself into the head chair, the way even the youngest grandchild sensed something had changed. Respect doesn't shout. It's built one steady act at a time. For years, I thought my duty was only to keep giving. My time, my strength, the very roof over our heads. Giving is good, but not if you let people forget what it cost you. That night I wasn't angry. What I felt was quieter, heavier, and somehow lighter at once. The dignity that comes from standing firm without raising your voice. By choosing patience and preparation instead of bitterness, I reminded my son of the man who had built those walls, who had paid every bill, who had always left a place set for him, even when money was tight. Margaret used to say, "Love teaches, but it also protects." That day I protected the lesson as much as the house. I showed Paul, and maybe the children too, that kindness isn't surrender. You don't let anyone decide you're too old, too small, or too tired to hold a place at your own table. As I turned off the dining room light, the keys warm in my palm, I felt a quiet satisfaction. I had reclaimed more than a house. I'd reclaimed my place in the story of the family I helped build. And yes, I remembered the sentence that had carried me through every sleepless night. I wasn't allowed to sit at the head of the table. I left and came back with the keys to the house. That line isn't about revenge, not really. It's about setting a boundary with grace and teaching the people you love to honor it. If you ever find yourself pushed to the corner, remember, you don't need to shout to reclaim your seat. Sometimes, you just need calm hands, a clear head, and the courage to walk back in with your own keys. Would you have handled it the way I did? I'd love to read your thoughts below. And if stories of quiet strength and well-earned dignity speak to you, subscribe and join me for the next one.